It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly segment where we dive into the world of Korean literature, both in English and in Korean as well. Joining us this week, we have cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Kolin의 한국, and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. Colin, hello. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Jang-ho.
Now, this week we are continuing our celebration of Han Kang's recent Nobel Prize win in literature. Special Korea Book Club 3-part series looking at some of her works. And today we have the book that started it all for Han Kang, or at least as an international literary phenomenon.
Indeed, and it's a book many readers of Korean literature will be revisiting right about now. It's 채식주의자, or The Vegetarian, which in 2016 won the International Booker Prize for both Han Kang and for its translator, Deborah Smith. Before I give my review of the novel, we have a soundbite of Anders Olsen, the chair of the Swedish Academy's Nobel Committee for Literature. And this is how he described The Vegetarian during the announcement of Han Kang's win.
Her major international breakthrough was the novel The Vegetarian from 2007, and a harshly effective yet poetic portrayal of the violent consequences that proceed from the protagonist's refusal to eat meat. Han Kang's physical empathy for the vulnerable, often female lives, is palpable and reinforced by her metaphorically charged prose.
Okay, so you can sense, I feel, the Nobel Committee's deep understanding and appreciation of the book and Han's writings in general. Before we get into The Vegetarian, what did you make of Han's win? What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, when the Nobel Prize announcement came out, I actually felt a bit of déjà vu, because it reminded me of the Booker moment 8 years ago, both in the sense that it wasn't all that surprising. People have been talking about her as a potential Nobel laureate for a long time, and that you could feel how much the status of Korean literature in the world was about to change, or still is about to change. The news came to me somewhat indirectly while we were having dinner. My wife checked her phone because notifications kept coming in and in and in. And it turned out to be all the members of our reading group enthusing over the Nobel. Oh, wow, finally she wins. I should note, however, we were eating at a neighborhood samgyetang place, which is perhaps not quite in keeping with the spirit of this particular book.
Right, indeed. True to its title, in either Korean or English, this novel does indeed deal with a vegetarian. We should point out that today we are reviewing the English translation of the book, because we know you could do either, Colin, but it is Deborah Smith's translation, and we point that out because there are differences, which we will perhaps get to a bit later. But first, can you tell us what the book is actually about, and who exactly is the vegetarian?
This eponymous vegetarian is a woman, seems like in her 30s, named Yong-hye, who, though not the novel's protagonist, is very much its central character. A series of disturbing, blood-soaked dreams lead her to suddenly quit eating not just meat, but all animal products. And so come to think of it, a more accurate title might have been The Vegan, but in any case, she makes this choice much to the frustration of her husband, who narrates the first third of the book, and also to the bewilderment of her family. The most dramatic scene in the whole novel has Yong-hye's father attempting to force-feed her a piece of meat, which results in Yong-hye cutting her own wrists then and there. And the suicide attempt isn't successful, but it does constitute the last such act she commits before orienting her very existence toward complete non-violence. Almost, one might say, living not just as a vegetarian, but like a plant.
Yes, as some of our readers might be able to tell from that brief description even, it is quite a challenging read at times, addressing some dark and difficult topics. There have even been reports recently of people in Korea who picked up the book after her Nobel Prize win, who have struggled to get through some of the more difficult sections. So I think that is something to note for newcomers. You mentioned that this is Young-hae's story, but also that it isn't actually narrated by Young-hae herself. The first third is told in the voice of her husband. What about the other two?
The novel is structured as a triptych, a word I throw around. If I'm using it correctly, I'm not sure, with a different perspective character in each part. Part 2 uses close third-person narration to describe the thoughts and actions of Young-hae's brother-in-law, the husband of her sister In-hye, and Part 3 does the same with In-hye herself. Han Kang sets up an almost farcical dynamic, if that's the word for a book this grim, in which Young-hye's husband desires In-hye, while In-hye's video artist husband desires Yong-hye, but only after finding out that she has a distinctive blue Mongolian mark on her rear end. And he develops an obsession with involving her in his latest project, this long-dreamed-of video, in which her entire body will be painted with flower designs, incorporating the Mongolian mark at the center. And this elaborate image, much like the grisly ones in the dreams that move Yong-hye to vegetarianism, actually has come to him at night. We could say that whatever drives her to renounce meat and him to make this floral body painting video comes from the same psychological place. And we could also say that both efforts bring each character to a kind of ruin.
Okay, so there are challenging explorations about desire and sexuality in this book as well then. So, as I said, these themes, they're not usually the stuff of popular novels. But after winning the Booker, the Vegetarian became successful around the world. Why do you think that is? Why do you think her book has resonated with so many readers, both inside and outside of Korea, and perhaps even more so outside of Korea?
It could be it's entered so many languages, not just English. And to win a prize like the Booker, writing a good book, of course, is not sufficient. You've also got to write a book that appeals to the concerns of the zeitgeist in general, and of the judges of global literary awards in particular. And in The Vegetarian, we have a novel written by a woman, about a woman, who essentially sacrifices herself to stand against the demands of a conformist society, embodied by her boorish husband, her violent father, and her self-serving brother-in-law. And even In-hye, Yong-hye's modestly successful, endlessly dutiful older sister, comes to resent her rebellion. Han Kang writes in Smith's translation that, and I quote, "She'd been unable to forgive her for soaring alone over a boundary she herself could never bring herself to cross, unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Yong-hye to shuck off social constraints and leave her behind, still a prisoner." Now, all of this is not to say that Han Kang wrote this book expressly in order to win the Booker, but it was certainly an astute choice as the first of her books to put on the market of what's called global fiction. I should note that The Vegetarian, or rather 채식주의자, came out here in Korea in 2007 as Han Kang's fifth novel, and her first four have never been published in English at all. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call the post-vegetarian Han Kang a much more engagé writer than before. Human Acts, her second novel, published in English translation, was her ninth Korean novel, Sonyo ni Onda, and that one deals directly with the Gwangju Uprising of May 1980. And that's just the sort of event I suspect the Nobel Committee likes writers to address. And a visible commitment to liberatory political causes, broadly speaking, surely doesn't hurt your chances of going to Stockholm. That's got to be one reason Nobel laureates tend to win the prize fairly deep into their life and career, so as to minimize the chances of an inconvenient change of political views later on.
Right, that's an interesting analysis. But yes, while The Vegetarian is her most famous work, perhaps because of the International Booker Prize, it is just one work in a diverse collection that she has written, many of which have not even yet been translated yet, as you said. But I'm sure it is this collection as a whole, plus their place in the world we live in at the moment, which will have influenced the Nobel Committee's decision. But as you said, what's remarkable about her win as well is not just that she was Korean, but also her age. At 54 years of age, she's the youngest winner since Albert Camus in 1957. So you say it wasn't much of a surprise to you, but I think for many people it was a surprise, especially because of her age. Some might have thought that she would win a Nobel Prize in Literature in many years' time, but the fact that she won it right now, I think, caught a lot of people by surprise, including herself, of course.
True. I mean, in the words of Michael Breen, author of the book The Koreans, you live here long enough, it's easy to forget that Korea is not the center of the world. So I was always thinking it's about time for Korea to win. Everybody says it, you know, if someone wins, Han Kang probably will win. So that's my line of thinking that made me somewhat less surprised, but...
A key question now, then, I guess, will be, where does a writer like her go from here after winning essentially the highest award in international letters? Interestingly, she gave an interview recently where she said she wouldn't be able to write The Vegetarian now, and that it's something that she could only do, that she could only write in her younger days.
It makes sense. When I was rereading, The Vegetarian this past week, I found myself thinking of one particular book by another Nobel laureate, J.M. Coetzee, who won the prize in 2003 and remains my personal favorite living non-Korean novelist. Before winning the Nobel, he too wrote a novel about a vegetarian called Elizabeth Costello, whose eponymous protagonist is an acclaimed, semi-retired novelist from Australia, still outspoken about her pet causes and a bit too outspoken, it seems at times. She says aloud at one point in the book, "I seem to move around perfectly easily among people, to have perfectly normal relations with them. Is it possible, I ask myself, that all of them are participants in a crime of stupefying proportions? Am I fantasizing it all? I must be mad, yet every day I see the evidences. The very people I suspect produce the evidence exhibit it, offer it to me. Corpses, fragments of corpses that they have bought for money. And of course she means meat, and though Yong-hye wouldn't express that thought in those terms, it would hardly be alien to her, the thought itself. And Elizabeth Costello in the book is famous for having written a feminist retelling of James Joyce's Ulysses, called The House on Eccles Street. And Kutsi notes how, at the many public appearances she still has to make so late in her career at minor universities, on cruise ships, she is, without exception, and to her own great irritation, introduced as the author of The House on Eccles Street and other novels. And Kutsi understands the dangers that faces a writer who collects too many laurels too early, and the kind of living intellectual and artistic death that can easily result. And we may worry over the prospect of Han Kang spending the next 30 years as author of The Vegetarian and other novels, but like Kutsi, she's also known to be wary of publicity. And nothing is more difficult to imagine than her delivering a lecture on a cruise ship. And also, like him, she seems both protective of her own creative freedom, and when it comes to her worldview, quite bloody-minded, strange as it sounds to apply that term to a pacifist vegetarian.
Right, well, I do think she has been moved by the recognition by the Swedish Academy. I do feel that she would be very uncomfortable with all the attention that she is getting right now.
No doubt.
A testament to a humble nature. But at the same time, I think she would take on that burden of responsibility and take on that to help produce more works, more interesting works in the future as well. There is one final thing to note about The Vegetarian, and I mentioned this very briefly earlier. It is about the English translation by Deborah Smith, because there are famously some discrepancies with the original Korean, right?
There are. I mean, I don't get too worked up about mistranslation, so they say, because it happens in every book. But if you think back, you might remember the controversy also centered around the prose styles being different. Han Kang's prose style is quite austere. Deborah Smith's has more than a little of the 19th century about it. And this set off a whole conversation about the importance of faithfulness versus reinterpretation in prose style as well. And in fact, just a few months ago, I heard a long-established translator of Korean fiction describe The Vegetarian as not a translation, but an adaptation. Fighting words in the translation world. So to a degree, it's still clearly controversial today, but I think nobody can argue with what it's done for Han Kang and for Korean literature as a whole.
Right, there is some controversy, but there is always this argument about how there can never be a perfect translation anyway. And she still seems to have captured, I guess, the essence of Han Kang's works, at least, whether in English or Korean. People have been utterly moved by her stories. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but Colin, thank you for helping us revisit The Vegetarian for this very special edition of Korea Book Club. It's been a pleasure as always, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
Thank you, Jong-ho. Look forward to next time.
And that's where we wrap up our show for today. We'll be back same time tomorrow, so we do hope you join us again then. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you, as always, for listening. Goodbye.